I'm in the way?
It's okay.
Good evening, everyone. The topic of my talk is the power of persuasion. Although it was advertised as all about propaganda, and as the first thing I have to tell you is the only thing which was propaganda about the talk of tonight is the fact that we used the word propaganda. So we wanted to have a buzzword to draw attention to you guys. Not much about my talk is actually propaganda. But let me ask another question to you guys. Clicker? Of course it's not working. What is every human's goal in life? Give me some words. Just
whatever they think it is.
Reproduction.
reproduction, interesting. Something else.
Happy.
Money maybe.
Happy.
Power.
Power.
Service.
Those are all very good suggestions. What I thought of was, next slide please, money maybe, family, power, influence, self-realization. But if we think about it, well, all of these relate to one final goal, which is love? No, but happiness. So, thank you. So happiness, what does happiness actually entail? We don't really know it because it means something else for every person. Each of us has a different understanding of what will make him happy. The same concept under a different name would be utility, which is embedded in economic sciences. So they speak always about utility maximization, economists. So mainstream economics says that monetary wealth is what brings us utility. Social sciences rather think, mostly, this is of course generalizations, that it is rather social relations and relationships which bring us happiness. If you are more into esoteric or spiritual thinking, it might be a purpose in life. What can we draw of all this? Every human is a utility maximizer, but we don't know for each person what it actually means, where this happiness comes from. So, depending on each person's worldview, which I will explain later what that actually means or entails, the assumption about how each individual utility is maximized varies. So this diversity entails also that each person makes his decisions based on his assumption about how he or she creates the greatest outcome in terms of utility. So each of us has a certain set of correlations in his mind behind his decision-making architecture, which always relate to how decisions and choices are made in systems. And now, maybe the flip will be a little bit hasty, but I'm studying sustainable development. So we are always thinking about how do people make choices? Because often the easiest choice is only the best choice for oneself and not for the so-called greater good or for the planet or for the whole society. So we have to think about what are the reasons why people make their choices and how can we make people change from unsustainable choices, which are comfortable, to more sustainable choices. One thing is clear, blaming is not going to help it, because if someone is blamed, he gets defiant and gets marginalized, and you don't want to be blamed, you don't want to feel bad about your choices. So we have to find a more intrinsic, automatic way of addressing each person's utility assumptions, how we call them. As I have said before, individuals are all different and they make their choices differently. So all scientific models always try to look at the whole system, at how the system reacts to certain inputs and what is happening to the system. But you cannot understand a system if you don't understand the systemic inputs. Each single input of the system is independent. Of course they are all interdependent, but you have to go to the lowest level to be able to determine or to manipulate the whole systemic outcomes. Society is especially complex because, as I have said before, each utility assumption determines for each person alone how he or she makes their decisions. So the agent-based modeling approach takes account of this phenomenon in society and tries to model each single individual with one representation in a visual conceptual model. So what we are trying to do is relate the agent-based modeling and the assumption about utility and each person's decision-making together. So we want to create a model which shows how each person's utility assumption relates to the final outcome when it comes to A, economic output, and B, environmental damage. So, but models need simplification. If we say everyone is different, we cannot put this in a model. We need some kind of more abstract way of putting it. And one way to do it is categorize everyone into two categories, which are purpose seekers and profit seekers. This might be a little bit simplified, but as I said, models want simplification. Otherwise, you cannot start with 100,000 different categories. But each of them have this utility maximization trend. Another scholar of this university, Professor Bert de Vries, has put these two simplifications in a broader model, which is called worldviews. So let's look at the axis. We have two axes. One is idealistic versus materialistic, and the other one is universal or global versus local. What we can see is four different fields arise. We have mind versus matter and giving versus taking. Bottom left, we have A1, which is objective materialism. So people who are thinking globally, but materialistic. Think about global corporations which want to get a lot of money as a whole and extend the income from their corporate activity. On the right side, we have the individualistic and materialistic frame, which would be called subjective materialism. The keyword for this area would be consumption. So each of us, if embedded in this mindset or worldview, a consumer only, which tries to maximize its own benefit, would be conceptualized as an A2 person. B1, we call them also geoengineers, is objective idealism, which have a more idealistic view about the world and try to address global issues like pollution or overpopulation, things which need a more long-term thinking. And as a last frame, we have subjective idealism, which is communities which are very much embedded in themselves and their own lifestyle. Tribes would be subjective idealism unless they are self-sustainable. So what do we do with these four worldviews? Worldviews modeling now tries to put 100 agents into this model and have them interact with each other in over a 100 years time frame. So we randomly distribute those four worldviews in this model and have for each of the four worldviews a particular impact on the two variables, which are, like I said before, economic output and environmental damage. Economic output then again gets redistributed among the agents as income, which is clear, right? The better the economy grows, the higher is the probability that our income as a single agent increases. And the same is true for environmental damage. The greater the total environmental damage in the system, the greater the probability that me as an individual gets affected by it. Say, air pollution, or a hurricane, or even worse, a tornado. All these could be linked to environmental damage for the globe, and then would be interpolated on the individuals. So let's put some numbers. I don't really like numbers, but for models, numbers are essential. You could argue that these numbers are fairly random, and they are, because they are just supposed to visualize something. So we just put in these numbers. A1 has an impact on economic output by 3% and doesn't really care for the environment, whereas A2, which would be the subjective materialism, has a lower output growth because they are just consuming, they are not contributing to global growth, and they also don't care about reduction of environmental damage. In contrast to the B agents, which try to diminish the impact of environmental damage. So the amount of these four worldviews determine how the two curves which we try to model are evolving in the final model. Coming back to the utilities, we have these nice curves. The more x increases, the greater the utility for the A agents. The more x increases, A2 has a more linear shape of the curves. Only B1 and B2 have less utility per additional unit of x. And as you can see, as I said before, environmental damage is not really a concern for A1 and A2. It's only B1 and B2 which have a certain reaction to a further increase of environmental damage. So every model needs some kind of dynamics. So to have a very spontaneous or very dynamic model, we had to think up some mechanisms under which the whole model changes. So as a first one, we called it a utopia-reality gap. Imagine you're a hardcore businessman and you are trying to increase the world economy a lot. Each year you are trying to have more people buy your goods, and you lower the cost, you increase your profits, but the world economy is not growing. So we are saying if the expected outcome is not taking place after 3 years period in the model, people randomly change their worldview. The same is true for the B1 and B2 agents. If you always invest your own income to better the world and nothing is happening because the rest of the world is still acting without any concern for what's happening, I'm sure some people of you know what I mean, you get frustrated. And this frustration has to be in some way or the other reflected in our model. A second mechanism is satisfaction thresholds, which are created by the distributed global variables. So I said before, we have economic output, which gets distributed as income, and environmental damage, which gets distributed as exposure. So assume you are, again, a very rich businessman, and you have a BMW and a huge villa, and then comes the hurricane, and you suddenly have nothing. Maybe you have insurance, but still this incident will eventually make you consider your choices. At least that's what we are pretending for the sake of this model. That if you have an individual disaster from environmental damage as A1 or A2 agent, you automatically reconsider your choices and flip to one of the other agents, B1 or B2. And the same is true for the income. I mean, you can be a good citizen and very sustainable all you want. But if you don't have the money to sustain this lifestyle, you eventually will start thinking, I have to change something. I cannot live like this. And the third one, which is the basic reason why we need the agent-based modeling, is agent interaction. What I'm doing right here, right now, is interacting with you. At least that's how I perceive it. I'm not sure about you. Okay, I see responses. Very nice. I'm trying to convince you of something. I'm trying to convey a message. And this is what happens in, I would say, 70% of human interaction. There's some kind of spillover of ideas. And the same we assume for the model, that whenever two agents meet in the model, there is an exchange of ideas. But whether this really leads to a sustainable change of ideas and a change of worldview is dependent on two things. Good arguments, which could be perceived as power, so you have to be versed in what you're talking about, and you have to know what you're talking about, and present it in a way that it is convincing to the other. You need persuasiveness. And the other one needs to have some kind of vulnerability. He has to be susceptible to what you're saying. Otherwise, you're running against the wall. For instance, if we have an A1 agent who has a lot of money, but has no environmental exposure whatsoever, so he has never experienced any environmental concerns by himself, it will be very hard to make him change his opinion just by saying, but the world, what's with the planet? You will not make him consider his choices like that. Only if he has himself already experienced the global conditions personally, he might have a certain way of changing his view. But only, again, if your power, if your good arguments will make him flip. Again, the numbers, we say, we call them, the power of persuasion would be delta, and the susceptibility to persuasion or for persuasion would be epsilon. So delta x, so the power of persuasion for the economic growth paradigm is equal to your income. And this is true for A1 and A2. Whereas the power to persuade for income or for economic growth for B1 and B2 is 0, because they don't want to convince for that paradigm. And you can flip these values around, because the A1 and A2 agents don't have an interest to persuade for the paradigm of environmental protection. They only have an interest to persuade for global protection on the basis of their environmental exposure. And the susceptibility, like in turn, also relates to the distributed global variables, income and environmental exposure. So depending how much income you have, as a B agent, you are susceptible to be persuaded by growth, or depending on your exposure, how powerful you are in persuading an A agent. I hope that was not too quick, but my time is limited, so maybe you can ask again after the presentation. What do we expect from this model? We want to show a dynamic equilibrium, that there is no way we will be able to convince the whole world of one worldview. Growth, global growth is the best. Economic growth is the best. It won't work. We cannot convince the world that we all need to drive electric cars and only eat organic food. I don't think that's possible. But what we can do is have an equilibrium of the four worldviews whose impacts will level the negative outputs from environmental protection, which would be a very diminished growth, or the negative outcomes of economic growth, which would be environmental degradation. So if we manage to have an integrated worldview where all four worldviews feel comfortable and see their basic needs addressed, we can have a balanced approach where no one has too little money to sustain his lifestyle and the planet has some way to be healthy. Because, as I tried to point out, if we have too much A agents, we have a lack of utility as the exposure to environmental damage deprives the well-being eventually. And if we have too much B agent, the lack of income as it is distributed economic output will not make it possible for us to live at all. These are very strong claims, of course, but models need some kind of graphic outcome to have. They tell a story, they tell a narrative, and that's what we are trying to tell. So what might happen to the global economic and ecological system if we don't change our behavior is one of the goals of the exercise. And can we really achieve continuous happiness or utility, or however you might call it, well-being, if we stick to business as usual and there is no overspill of ideas, if we cannot make some people understand that we need to think more consciously? And which is a personal aim of mine, is to put these model or the assumptions within the model into field work and try to make surveys to find out where these satisfaction thresholds are. So when can a person bear anymore that he cannot breathe? Is there really a change in opinion? Is there a point where you flip because you don't have enough money and you start to spend more vigorously? Are the assumptions correct? You could argue that it is more sensible to do it the other way around, to do field work first and then put it into a model. But I think the model exercise here facilitates telling the narrative. So we went for the modeling first, fieldwork later approach. Let's see whether this will work out. Maybe it's going to be shaped into a master thesis. These are my sources. I really hope your utility got a little bit increased by this knowledge input. If not, feel free to write me an email or just enjoy the rest of the evening to a greater extent. Thank you very much.